everyone. Thank you for joining the CGLCC's Digital LGBT and Global Business Summit Illuminate. On behalf of DCM, a longtime proud sponsor of this summit, I'm glad to be here once again. As companies that help others drive digital transformation, we appreciate how important inclusion and diversity are, not only to a healthy supply chain and a healthy company, but a healthy, robust economy. Simply put, diversity and inclusion are good for business. On that note, I'm pleased to introduce TJ Jones, who will lead the next session on creating an inclusive corporate environment.
Plastic cups singing love is forever and never. Well, I guess that was true.
Good afternoon. So I meant to do that trick where, when you're public speaking, you're a bit nervous, you have to go stand in the space, and I didn't get a chance to do that, so bear with me as I find my footing for a moment. But I'm here to speak with you today a little bit on creating a 2S LGBTQ inclusive corporate environment. So we've had a lot of content today already, today and yesterday, speaking about how we can go about creating more inclusive spaces for our workers and our customers. Today I'm just going to take you through a little bit more tangible examples of what you can take home with you to your different businesses and organizations. It is a firm press, yes. All right, so I'm actually here from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. So to begin my session, I would like to do a land acknowledgement for my home. I acknowledge Ukta-Umkuk, or colonially known as the island of Newfoundland, and the land from which I predominantly work, as the unceded traditional land of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. I also acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuavut. I respect the culture, traditions, and ceremonies of all who have, do, and will call this place their home, and endeavor to serve my role in reconciliation as a settler of European descent wholeheartedly. I see what Amber was talking about when they were going through, yeah. It's not doing a thing. There we go. Okay, so a bit of an agenda for today. So the plan, recognizing that language can shift and evolve, I'm going to take you through a very gentle sort of introductory to us LGBTQ language introduction. I'll take you through some inclusion considerations. All right, thank you so much. Some inclusion considerations to help you develop your strategy, look at some signs of what actually makes an environment inclusive for these communities, and then some examples of best practices. And then the goal at the end is to take you through some starting steps to begin your journey. So the 2S LGBTQ intro. So this is a very expanded version of the acronym. I know here within the chamber they use the LGBT plus acronym, but I was really grateful to hear and happy to hear that they're looking at expanding some of that language. I think it's important to reflect that the terminology in the acronym has definitely expanded over the last few years as we've developed more inclusive language to represent the different identities that exist within these broader communities. The 2S is centered within this particular acronym, again, in the spirit of reconciliation and to recognize the history within Indigenous cultures. Indigenous cultures have had reverence and respect for different elements of our spirituality, our orientation, our sexuality, long before us Western colonizers had language to even start talking about this. So I think it's important to center that experience. The other acronym that you see at the bottom, SOGIESC, is used within different cultures and different communities as well to reflect that sometimes we have to look at sort of the idea that we're talking about versus the labels that we use to talk about them. So that acronym stands for sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sexual characteristics. This one tends to be used a little bit more within newcomer communities. A little bit of very introductory terminology, but looking at sexuality, it's how we feel about and identify our capacity to feel sexual feelings. Orientation is who it is that we feel those sexual and romantic attractions towards, their gender expression, etc. And then attraction is the presence of and ways in which we experience attraction to others. So that could be our physical, emotional, or romantic styles of attraction and relationships. It's important, I think, to notice too that over 1 million Canadians, and we've heard some different stats over the last 2 days, over the age of 15 plus identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, with 30% being between the ages of 15 to 24. I highlight that number just because as we look at incorporating new inclusive practices for our incoming workforces, we have younger people that will now be joining the workforce, and younger demographics and generations are much more open and much more almost demanding around different expectations in terms of inclusion practices. So we need to keep that in mind as we navigate the changing workforce. Some terminology, I think, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to reflect that language does evolve over time, and as generational considerations are brought into the workplace, and as we navigate creating space for younger workers, it's important to reflect on the language that folks might be using now. So pansexual colloquially is referred to a sexuality that relates to people being attracted to people based on their hearts, not their parts. It's how I've heard it described, at least. Polyamory is a style of relationship dynamic that involves people who are in multiple relationships with multiple people at the same time. The important caveat there being that everybody involved is aware of it, otherwise it's something else entirely. An aromantic person is someone who can identify as having an absence of romantic interest, so they may engage with their partners in a sexual context, but not necessarily experience romantic attraction in our societal definition of the term. So this is a cute little graphic that I tend to use just to kind of help position conversation around gender identity and diversity. So gender identity is our intrinsic sense of self. It's who we know ourselves to be. The way I describe it is when, sort of you close your eyes and all the social expectations about how we're supposed to perform our gender, how we're supposed to perform our gender roles, when all of that falls away, it's who we know ourselves to be. Gender expression is sometimes used as a vehicle to share our gender identity with the world, but not necessarily. In some ways, we may have folks that present in a way where we perceive their gender expression in a way that may not align with what we perceive their gender identity to be. That being said, gender expression is the only part of any of these sort of descriptors of identity that we can actually perceive with our own eyes. We can't look at someone and tell what their gender identity is. We can't look at someone and tell what their sexual orientation is. And we definitely can't tell what someone's attraction style is. These are all things that we have to kind of explore with that person, get to know, and we really need to avoid making assumptions. So the important part, and why I use this tool to talk about this, is because it helps us realize that while these may inform each other, they may be parts of our identity that play together, we can't really make assumptions about any of them, and we need to tease them apart. And when we do that, it helps us avoid making assumptions, it helps us avoid perpetuating stereotypes, and really that's a big part of creating inclusive environments, particularly for workers. It's important, I think, too, to notice that as of last year, so last year we had our first national survey that actually provided the opportunity for respondents to both include their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. So I'm super excited to see, as a data nerd, what might come out of that. But I think it's important to note that over 100,000 folks over the age of 15 identified themselves as trans or non-binary. So obviously, I myself am trans, we're everywhere, and we're gonna be everywhere, and we're gonna continue to expand our communities. Another important part of that as well is 62% of those folks were under the age of 35. So much like the other stat that I shared, we really need to recognize that the younger workforce will have expectations when they come into their workplace. Some other terms I thought might be helpful to define. Trans-feminine and trans-masculine sometimes confuse people. Folks are usually curious about the direction of transition. So just to break it down, trans-feminine folks are transitioning towards femininity, and trans-masculine folks, like myself, are transitioning towards masculinity. Non-binary has definitely picked up in popularity in the last few years. There are a lot of folks who use that to describe their gender, and it just means that they might feel outside of our traditional binaristic gender system. A cisgender person is someone whose identity is in alignment with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And I usually encourage folks to really try and incorporate that into their sense of self and how they talk about their gender, because everybody on the planet has a gender identity. It's just some of us have to think about it a little bit more than others. So if you are cis, so if you were assigned male at birth, you grew up being called a boy, using he and him pronouns, and it made sense for you, chances are you're cis. And I encourage you again to integrate that because it puts you in the conversation. It helps get us away from trans people and normal people. When looking at transition, some folks actually seek out all, some, or no aspects of it, and there can be many, many reasons why we do that. Some of us have medical considerations in preventing us from accessing hormone replacement therapy. Some of us may not have the resources. Some of us may not have the support. But there are three main elements that I'd like to kind of highlight for folks. Social transition is when you might change your name. It might be your gender marker, it might be your expression. Medical is when you look at sort of that medical intervention piece with a medical professional. So you're talking about hormone replacement therapy, affirmative surgeries. And then legal transition is when you go through the nightmare of getting your name and gender marker changed legally. And that can take a very long time. I know for myself, I still have, so I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador, as I mentioned, and I have MCP coverage, which is our local provincial medical coverage. It still has an F on it just because I'm lazy and I can't be bothered to deal with that. but it causes interesting conversations in medical environments, I can tell you that. So that's a bit of fun there. But I think it's important to reflect on the legal side of things, that particularly as service providers, or if you're hiring new people, there may be folks that are at different points in their transition, so you may need to consider that as you navigate sort of the hiring process. You may have folks that introduce themselves with one name, and then they give you their identification and it has another name on it. Some challenges from society around transition are the lack of general knowledge, the harassment, assault, and violence that can occur because of that lack of knowledge and bias, and then the social expectations and perceptions of gender norms, roles, and stereotypes. Some challenges for trans folks are the lack of support and invasive questions. If you've had any context for talking about gender diversity with people, chances are you've heard folks talk about being asked about surgeries. I don't know where it's relevant unless we're potential partners that you need to know about my genitalia, but it's definitely something that trans folks have to navigate on a very, very frequent basis. The impacts on mental health, having that lack of support, having to constantly justify your existence in a lot of ways, can have really, really negative impacts on your mental health. Looking at the rigmarole involved with correcting your IDs and documentation can take a bit of time. And then also access to affirmative care. I know here in Ontario, there's a lot more access for folks. There's a lot more accessible medical coverage, things like that. HIP is pretty spot on. For myself in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have one general physician who actually declares herself willing to provide gender affirmative care. Newfoundland's huge, so that can be quite challenging for folks in the community back home. Some key takeaways: gender diverse people do not owe society a transition. And I think a lot of people get caught up in this because there's that discomfort, there's the challenge with shifting pronouns, particularly if you've known somebody pre-transition. And there's this difficulty with kind of adopting new language, new names that we use for folks. But because of all these different reasons, as I've mentioned, not everybody can access it. So really the takeaway for that is that gender diverse people don't owe society a transition to have their identities respected, whether it makes sense or it's comfortable or it's easy. We really need to do the work to respect a person's identity. So names and pronouns are a pretty big conversation that comes up around gender diversity. I have a lot of questions directed my way around how to use pronouns correctly. The key takeaway for that is just follow people's lead. Whatever language they share with you, whatever language they disclose, whether they have it on their name tags, they have it in their e-signatures, we just need to do the work to respect that and to do the work to get familiar enough and respectful enough to actually adhere to that when we interact with those folks. They're an important vehicle for both sharing and respecting gender identity, so we can even lead by example when we introduce ourselves, we can share our own pronouns, and they continue to matter when a person's not around. I've encountered a lot of folks in the past who look at sort of, I only need to do this when this person's in front of me, and that's not true because it's disrespectful to sort of backpedal when you're not interacting with the person, but it also really helps affirm that new muscle memory and new association if you continue to use it. Plus, you can also help call in your colleagues and other folks in that person's life. We don't get to decide another person's pronouns based on how we perceive them. Again, follow people's lead. And when mistakes happen, because they do happen, the best practice really is to just apologize, correct yourself, and move on. You just have to sort of acknowledge the mistake, commit to doing better next time, and then continue on the conversation. A lot of the time, folks have this instinct to make this big grandiose apology, and that actually puts the emotional labor on the person who just had their gender identity disrespected to make you feel better about making a mistake. And chances are it's not the first time it's happened for that person that day, so apologize, correct yourself, and continue. So some inclusion considerations. This is a lot of words on a screen, and we've talked about a lot of this already, but just to sort of reiterate some points. When we look at 2S LGBTQ+ inclusion, it really does affirm and expand other broader D&I initiatives. It helps us maintain adherence to legislation and avoid litigation costs, sort of human rights complaints, those sorts of things. And just something worth considering is we actually do have precedent now in the country around human rights complaints when it comes to misgendering specifically. There was a case in BC where a server was being intentionally misgendered by her colleagues. Sorry, I just misgendered this person, by their colleagues. And they actually brought it to the Human Rights Commission in BC, and they were awarded $30,000 in nominal sort of payment just because it was deemed that it was intentional disrespect of this person's gender and their identity. So I just think it's important to recognize the precedent has been set. It helps encourage innovation, much like we heard about yesterday. When we sort of have those moments of discomfort, it actually creates and opens us up to innovation. So it encourages that by challenging groupthink or technically how things have always been done and maintaining the status quo. It increases productivity, commitment, loyalty, pride through increased employee engagement. It heightens employer appeal, so it makes folks want to work for you. And it also reduces your turnover. It contributes to your organization's reputation and your ability to reach a larger market. It improves 2S LGBTQ workers' sense of safety at work. Folks feel valued, safe, more able to be all of who they are, and it increases cultural consideration of individual needs for safety. So I think we've heard a little bit about that already. The idea that when we start looking at how we can create more welcoming and safe environments, we can use a lot of those same principles across different marginalized and historically excluded groups. So these are just some general considerations to keep in mind when you're looking at building and developing your strategy. I think a really important one, which I might talk about a bit more than the rest, because we've touched on some of them already through sessions, is the idea of historical contexts. And I think within the concept of historical context, we can really reflect on the idea that there are very much so at play intergenerational differences when we're looking at queer and trans communities. I know that for myself, I have some different ideals and different experiences than folks that are of younger generations and also of folks that are of older generations. What might be more acceptable to me could have been a cakewalk for folks in older generations, considering where our levels of exploration and inclusion have gone. And then conversely, for younger folks, what I think is okay and makes me feel okay might not quite meet the bar for younger generations. And it's important to also recognize, too, that people are bringing in their historical context to your spaces. So even though you might be implementing, developing new strategies, it's important to recognize it might take them a bit of time to feel safe and included. So we just need to keep at it. The trusted sources of information piece talks about the idea that when you're not part of that dominant culture, you have to, as we can all attest to, you have to find access and find ways to see yourselves represented in production, in publications, those sorts of pieces. So when you're looking at trying to reach these communities, particularly in the younger generations, we have to figure out where they are and meet them there. The language use piece talks a little bit more about what's acceptable and how people may pick up cues depending on how you interact with them, the language that you use, those sorts of things. And sometimes we have to read between the lines to see, is this going to be a safe place for me to exist in? How much of myself can I be? The physical and psychological safety piece talks a little bit more about sort of occupational health and safety legislation. So I just try to encourage folks to keep in mind that now, particularly after COVID, we've started to expand our idea of OH&S to include mental health as well. And underneath mental health, that's where you can include the considerations for gender identity and respecting gender expression. And the sense of belonging is obviously the ultimate goal. So some considerations as well would be sort of the experiences of folks. So this is a bit of a dry stat slide, but I just wanted to include this to give people some context. And I think a lot of us can probably relate to this, but within sexual minority Canadians, 49% of folks that were surveyed by Statistics Canada in 2018 were able to report, unfortunately, that they had experienced inappropriate behavior in the workplace, which was almost twice as much as their heterosexual counterparts. The transgender population were able to report the same experiences at almost 70%, which was 3 times as many as their cis counterparts. So I just think it's really important to kind of consider that. Obviously, even though we have the legislation in place and everybody is protected across the country by that legislation, there's still occurrences of these unfortunate things being or transpiring in workplaces. Another thing to consider too, and this is just a series of questions that you can ask yourself as you develop and implement your strategies. Are you fostering safety, equity, and a sense of belonging through your organizational culture and HR practices? I'm realizing I have 18 minutes, so in the spirit, if you folks are curious, you can take a picture of this one. I don't want to waste the time reading it. But there are lots of ways that we can sort of engage in this process and consider where we are as an organization and our capacity to continue developing these kinds of strategies. This is also another way just, again, to position yourself, consider where you are, your capacity to do it, and be honest about it, because authenticity is really how you're going to reach most marginalized groups, really having the ability to own your limitations and own the requirements that you're trying to meet, and the goals and efforts that you have are really, really important, and that transparency piece can really help you meet people and help them feel as though you mean it. And it's not, again, that potential of pinkwashing or just looking at maybe we're going to make our logo a rainbow for June. Some of the challenges are achieving 2S LGBTQ inclusion. We have outdated or ineffectively enforced policies, insufficient training. I think AJ in one of the panels earlier talked about it. A lot of major organizations might look at you and say, okay, I've got 45 minutes. maybe too on the nose for my session here today, but you've got 45 minutes to an hour to talk about this. We want you to tick all the boxes. We want to get you through it. And that's not really, enough sometimes, especially if you're looking at a major corporate overhaul. The biases and attitudes that can exist within current workforces and management can definitely be sort of a stopgap or an imposition on the actual progress of these strategies. Lack of commitment and demonstration by leadership. It's all well and good if leadership says, okay, let's do this, we're going to do this, but then they don't model it themselves. It can really undermine the effort. And then the surface efforts as well. So not assessing whether your partners or your distributors are in alignment. So some signs of what makes an inclusive workplace, diverse staff and leadership, and to address sort of the absence of folks within these communities in C-suite level and upper management, you look at mentorship opportunities. I'm also a participant, a mentee of the Out for Business program, so I can attest to the benefits of those programs. You have access to gender-neutral washrooms and change rooms. Names and pronouns are shared, received well, and respected. Gender-neutral language is used. Displayed signage, including diversity in your imagery and marketing. Looking at participation in 2S LGBTQ+ events. So it's all well and good to have queer and trans-owned businesses. We use our platforms if we're able, especially on a corporate level, to really share and uplift the voices of these communities. Looking at acknowledging days of significance, regular organizational training. Workers feel able to talk about their partners. One of the examples, so I do a lot of training for non-2S LGBTQ groups, and one of the ways that I try to demonstrate that point about people being able to talk about their partners, because a lot of times folks really get caught up in this idea that there's no place for sexuality at work. We don't want to talk about that at work. It's not appropriate. But one of the ways I highlight that for folks is I say, well, imagine someone that looked like me standing at the water cooler talking about what I did with my wife on the weekend. Nobody's going to bat an eye. If someone like me said, imagine what I did with my husband on the weekend, chances are there's going to be some people in that space that may have some feelings about that. So there really is room to talk about this stuff in the workplace. And 2S LGBTQ+ workers feel able to contribute by sharing their perspectives and ideas. And again, when you're outside of that dominant culture, you develop different ways of thinking about the world and how you can better improve it. So some ways that we get there. And I've taken some of these highlights from our the CGLCC's Rainbow Register program. If you haven't heard of it, would recommend checking it out. Looking at policies and practices, which really help outline the organizational expectations for staff. Training really provides context and insight for non-2S LGBTQ workers, so around that cultural sensitivity piece. It ensures comprehension of those existing policies and practices and supports your workforce with the implementation of them. Commitment to inclusive leadership really demonstrates your organizational values through community-oriented actions beyond the day-to-day. And then culture of inclusivity helps your workers and customers see themselves and feel supported. So this is probably the part you're looking for, the examples of best practices. The recruitment and selection side of things, there are lots of elements that we can incorporate into our R&S practices, but these are just some takeaways. This is available through a study that was done through Pride at Work Canada in 2018. So some really great ways that you can reach folks within these communities is to publicize your 2S LGBTQ related policies on your website. Chances are, again, when we're used to potentially navigating these experiences at work, we're gonna do our research. So you can really check out, or if you publicize those policies, it helps folks feel more safe. Explicitly state that you are 2S LGBTQ friendly in your job postings. A lot of us are incorporating diversity statements into our job ads now, but it's really important to be direct and clear and actually list the folks that you are developing inclusive practices for, because again, as things are used a lot more frequently, we see diversity statements now and we don't know if that actually includes our communities or not. So it's important to be clear and direct. Leadership and staff receive specific training and advertise in 2S LGBTQ+ media. So again, make sure that you're reaching those trusted sources of information for these communities. Within training and development, you can look at training for all levels and acknowledge the different relationships and power dynamics amongst the sort of hierarchical structure within your organization. Gender-based violence awareness and bystander intervention training is a really, really great translatable skill to apply when sort of trying to challenge any kind of homophobic or transphobic behavior. Training informed by community-based lived experience is really important as well. But again, as it was mentioned earlier in one of the sessions, try to avoid imposing that on your queer and trans workers. Some of us just want to exist, as I'm sure we can all relate. And then comprehension, make sure that folks are actually comprehending the material and account for turnaround. A lot of people really look at it and say, one and done, I'm good, tick the box. That doesn't really work, particularly in different industries where there's higher turnover. Within your onboarding and culture management piece, you can look at making sure that your inclusion efforts are known and accessible. It's really about making them readily available to people so that They can tell that they're in place, but it also helps hold us accountable. You can collect and streamline, supplement your relevant existing policy. You can ensure, again, that review and comprehension. But it's also really important to be transparent about the reporting channels and the consequences. Otherwise, folks can just, again, take it as, this is just a surface thing. We're just ticking a box. The code of conduct or ethics piece really highlights acceptable and unacceptable language. And again, be direct and clear about this. We want to see what language is inappropriate. We want to see what terms people shouldn't be using, because I've found in the past that without that really clear, direct language, people will find loopholes. They'll plead ignorance. They'll say that they weren't aware. But by having things very clearly outlined, it gives that sort of policy teeth so that folks will have grounds to make their complaints and have them heard in a respectful way. Support ERGs, and develop a workplace transition plan. If folks aren't familiar with workplace transition plans, they're very great tools to have in place to support transitioning workers in your workplace. It really helps outline sort of the responsibilities of everybody involved in the process. Looking at your comp and ben plans, recognition of different family dynamics for leave, particularly around parental or caregiving roles and responsibilities. As a member of this community, and I'm sure we can all maybe relate in different ways, but my biological family, there aren't people I'd take time off for work, but with my chosen family, I'd be there in a heartbeat. So just kind of considering that. The language is really important to have that access. Recognition of and commitment to inclusive health coverage and providers. So again, looking at providers that actually provide trans affirmative care. An important thing too that I've encountered a lot of folks don't think about is having queer and trans friendly EAP service providers. We want to be able to actually send folks to people who will affirm their identities and not perhaps consider those identities part of why they're accessing EAP services to begin with. Data management, it's really important to look at the expanded options for gender, pronouns, family dynamics. We can't make assumptions. Looking at current, previous, or legal names. It's really helpful, I think, on a lot of forms, registration situations for you to have places that outline name and then legal name, if different, because again, it creates space for folks who are in different points or at different points within their transitions. Performance management, I think, is another place that maybe folks don't really consider when it comes to supporting queer and trans workers. A lot of the time, performance management is, are we meeting our deliverables? Are we meeting our goals? Are we, hitting the revenue markers that we want to see? But really considering what could be contributing to impact on performance around sort of having that awareness and acknowledgement that navigating queer and trans identities at work could be a reason why those things are shifting or changing, particularly if we don't have the culture to support them. Also developing an investigation procedure for addressing bullying and harassment. This is where that GBV prevention can come into it as well. And access to culturally informed mediation is really important. It's all well and good to have a mediation process, but if your mediators aren't aware and knowledgeable and able to support and have consideration for the nuance of what navigating these identities at work could mean, it's going to do you a disservice. When looking at marketing, this one's been talked a lot about, but display different relationship and family dynamics, gender presentations. There's lots of resources available. You can look at selected distribution channels to make sure that they're in alignment with your efforts. And then the PR and CSR pieces, again, that public declaration piece. Make sure that you're holding yourself accountable by putting it out there in the universe and making it accessible to folks that you A, want to interact with, and B, want to hire. Looking at your community engagement and your contributions and support for Pride and other organizations. You're here with the CGLCC, that's part of it. And then looking at inclusive procurement. Again, the supplier diversity program here is fantastic. Physical spaces, gender-neutral washrooms. I can't belabor this point enough, and it's not something that a lot of people can relate to if it's not part of their personal experience, but as a person who navigated transition for a lot of years, it's very interesting when the world tells you you're not allowed to use the washroom in public, and that's kind of how it lands sometimes, so it's really important to consider that. And it can be very, very helpful to have guidance in place for that adjustment period. So if you are doing sort of that overhaul process within your environment, it's important to have the guidance there to support folks. Having displayed signage in line with it is also helpful as well. It helps lay the expectations for other colleagues and coworkers. And it can be very, very helpful to declare again that this is what we as an organization are trying to accomplish and what we want to do. Hosted events are another piece where you can also have a lot of consideration for queer and trans folks. Looking at having those accessible spaces, even going so far as declaring same-sex couples are welcome and same-sex partners are welcome. A lot of us can probably relate to not knowing whether or not, is this going to have an impact on our performance, on our perception within our workplaces if we bring our same-sex partners or our differently gendered partners. It's really important to, again, be clear about those sorts of things, and then providing access to all access washrooms. I really appreciated when I walked into this space yesterday and they had duct tape signs to the washrooms, making them gender neutral. That, to me, love it. Guerrilla warfare right there. I appreciated it. Looking at dress codes and expectations that support gender identity and expression, that's really important as well. Again, business formal can mean different things around gender expectations, gender performance in ways that we're expected to perform. Having it clearly outlined that folks are allowed to wear a skirt if they have a beard can really, really be helpful, particularly for folks of those identities and non-binary people. And then also things to consider would be your dates, your venues, again, making sure they're inclusive. Registration process, name versus legal name tag. It's really important if you have sort of an automatic process where people register and that populates your name tag printing to make sure that it's the right one, not the legal name if it's different. Your programming, make sure that your programming reflects the folks you're trying to welcome into the space. Looking at your suppliers and contractors, again, for alignment. Entertainment, are people going to see themselves represented in how you're trying to entertain them? And then giveaways, prizes, and gift cards are very traditionally gendered. I've seen a lot of places that have power tools for men and spa days for women, and what if I want to go get my nails done? Why does that have to be a thing? So just really consider, the appropriateness and the relevance of how you're presenting those sorts of things. And then again, when you're trying to develop or implement any kind of new strategy, always provide opportunity for follow-up. So some first steps, build a plan. It's more so than just what can I do at work? It's, how can I contribute to this? But a lot of us are living this, and a lot of us are navigating that. So that's definitely something we can keep in mind. I think another important thing too to consider, especially around that sort of multi-generational or intergenerational consideration within queer and trans communities, is how can we demonstrate allyship across those generations? As language changes, as our needs and our requirements and our demands shift, we really need to know how to meet folks of different generations. And I know that that can be a challenge sometimes, especially when we're looking at language, but I think it's really important to look at doing your research. It's all well and good to have our own takes and our own perspectives, but if we're trying to create space that's welcoming for younger folks, we need to meet them where they are and learn the language that they're using. And listening to members as, they're talking about what they're experiencing. Be accountable, so apologize when you make a mistake, but be open to learning opportunities. A lot of the times, as I mentioned, when we misgender folks, we tend to get shut down. We get, if we want to make this grandiose apology, it becomes about the perception of us in that moment, not how we've impacted the other person. And I think it's important really just to continue, to stay open to learning and letting folks kind of provide that learning if they're open to it. I try to encourage people to move from a place of I'm sorry, which means we're in a shame place and we're shutting down, to thank you for taking the time to helping me learn. It keeps us open and it allows us to let more information in. And acknowledge and try to understand your privilege. And again, we've had conversations, particularly in yesterday's session around intersectionality, but privilege in this context just means that these particular things are not contributing to our challenges. And I think even within our communities, sometimes we lose sight of how those things can be impacted based on where we're positioned socially. And then carry it beyond the workplace. It's really just about all of the time, as much as we can, to advocate and create space. Some organizational first steps is to look at your current policies and practices. So look at where you are and what you're doing and identify any gaps and limitations and where you're trying to create the space for your 2S LGBTQ plus workers. Look at your organizational capacity. Again, this goes back to that transparency and accountability piece. We need to know what our limitations are, what we have to work with, depending on the size of our organization. Maybe we have a department, maybe we have an EDI director. All of these things can play into it, but we really need to be honest with ourselves because that can help set us up for success. It can put limitations on how far reaching we might try to be with our initiatives. Determine and engage your stakeholders. Maybe that does. If you are, folks within sort of older generations, it might be helpful to have committees that involve folks that are younger within these communities. And along the way, use your resources, much like the CGLCC. There's an excellent range of guides available for members if you're not a member already. So some key takeaways. To connect with your 2S LGBTQ workers or colleagues, really look at sort of learning that historical context, reach them where they are, and to welcome them, look at really challenging that language by modeling and enforcing appropriate, respectful language in all of your dealings and across sort of the organization, not just when you think somebody in the room might be offended. It's not about the sort of the PC culture. We really want to incorporate this across the board. And then champion and develop 2S LGBTQ inclusion strategy and policies, so like ERGs and those sorts of pieces. And then just really trying to empower and support folks of all ages and of all identities to be all of who they are and bring their whole selves into your workspace. And I think that was the end of my content. And I'm a minute and a half away, so that's great. So if there's any questions, thank you. So I called it. I found my legs, I think, about 5 slides in. I was like, I'm really, this is why I wear a black shirt. Yeah. But if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Yeah, go ahead.
One question. Oh. You made a comment in one of your slides in the middle around understanding, thank you, around understanding what your, I think you said partners and distributors were doing. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that a little bit? Please.
Yeah, no. So I think a good example for that would be if you are a product manufacturer and you say you developed a new insert, say for your product packaging, and it's more queer and trans friendly, it has visuals on it that can help, reach the community, and you are distributing it through someone who maybe doesn't have the same sort of ideas about that you do. You have this product, you put the money and the time into developing this new packaging, you send it to your distributor, they don't like what it says, so they're gonna hide it behind everything else. So it does a disservice. So they might, keep older packaging available from your product line or whatever the case may be. So what that does is it doesn't send that inclusive message across your distribution channels. So it's just a way to make sure that everybody that you're working with is in alignment and on the same page in terms of what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your inclusion efforts. Because it doesn't help if you have all that effort put into it and then it's hidden in the back or it's not put on the shelf. Is that a fair answer? Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? I think we're good. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
So I just wanted to come up here and say thank you so much to TJ. We just got to meet TJ in person recently, and we're all very excited because he's pretty much a part of the staff at this point. So we were very pumped. Thank you so much, TJ, for putting this together. We're really happy that you brought together all of the information we learned over the past 2 days to kind of give some takeaways. So hopefully you folks learned some best practices, and if you have any questions, ask TJ, not me.